Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, September 29th, 2023. Coming to you as always from beautiful Madison, Wisconsin. And one of the things that I've done repeatedly recently, I spoke about some of the issues that had concerned some of the tribal nations in Oklahoma. Recently, the pitcher lead mine situation that had happened there. I covered that a few weeks ago. But interestingly enough, friend of the program and wonderful investigative reporter, Greg Palast, who's known for his investigative reports for BBC, Democracy Now!, and Rolling Stone, well, he has a documentary he's been working on regarding the Osage Nation of Oklahoma. And I'm very happy to welcome him back so he can talk about this documentary. Greg, welcome to TMI.
Glad to be with you again, Aldous.
Now, I understand your new film is going to be called Long Knife, Osage Oil, and the New Trail of Tears. Is that correct?
That's correct. And yes.
All right. So now, when it comes to the Osage, I do know that they had a history of having some mineral rights that they were able to actually keep the rights in order to lease it. Tell us a bit about how this all starts.
Okay, well, let me give you something that's very important as part of this. Our documentary is a companion to the feature film, Killers of the Flower Moon, which will be starring Leonardo DiCaprio and directed by Martin Scorsese. It is also about the Osage. It's about the Osage nation, the tribe in the 1920s, and when the biggest oil strike in America was found on the Osage Reservation, Osage County, Oklahoma. And suddenly, the Osage, sitting on the biggest oil strike in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, became the richest people in the world per capita.
Wow.
The Osage tribal members became the richest on the planet.
Wow.
Well, of course, here's the one problem. Is that when suddenly we find out that there are Indians on top of our oil, suddenly the oil companies figure out a way to grab it. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Congress canceled the Osage right to develop their own oil. They had an agreement. They created an Osage Oil Company. They were not allowed. After 10 years, they were stopped from developing their own oil. Bureau of Indian Affairs said, "We'll take it from here, kiddos, because you as Indians are incompetent. So you are mentally incompetent. You're like children who cannot handle this sophisticated, all these millions of dollars that are coming in." So the Osage were prevented from not only developing their own oil, but from getting the money from their oil. Rather, it was put in the hands of guardians. That is, the U.S. Congress and the Bureau of Indian Affairs assigned a white guardian to every Osage Indian because the Osage couldn't handle their own money. So they said, you need a white guy to handle your money. And the guardians then systematically began to murder the people that they were guardians for. They began to murder their wards. Why? Because they were able to use their legal powers to name themselves as beneficiaries of the estates of the Osage. So when an Osage died, they got their oil rights.
So
now we're talking about.
So I was about to say, so it wasn't enough that they went and grabbed control of the whole situation. They then had to go ahead and actually kill the right. Osage people in order to get that. Now, I did want to bring up one thing real quick before we get any any further along. We've been talking a lot about labor recently, and so I want to make sure that when people hear the word oil strike, they don't think labor strike. We're talking about oil being found in the ground and gushing out. That's that kind of strike.
That's that eureka moment when the oil flies through the air. And of course, at that time when the Osage were drilling, they don't do that anymore, where you just watch the gusher go through the air and cover you with oil. But indeed, that's what happened. They had these massive gushers. Now you have to understand, when the Osage lost their oil, they made billions of dollars for other people, for other oil companies. Standard Oil, which was called something like Murtaugh Oil at that time, Rockefeller, the beginning of their fortune. Getty Oil. Getty had next to nothing until he got the Osage oil. Frank Phillips, Phillips 66. So you have J. Paul Getty, you have Rockefeller, you have Greg Phillips, Phillips 66. You have what became Conoco and now ConocoPhillips, Sinclair Oil. Sinclair, who later was at the center of the Teapot Dome scandal, at the same time that he was jacking the Osage, they're jacking the U.S. government by stealing U.S. government naval oil property. So these same characters now are considered, or as we call them, we don't call them robber baron, thieving, oil thieves, billionaires. They're now called philanthropists. See, if you steal enough, you're a philanthropist. So this is where these oil fortunes came from. Obviously, it was taken away from the Osage. And so the little bit of royal, so they were not allowed oil. They were not allowed to develop their own oil until actually very recently. I'm talking 100, took over 150 years to get their right to restore their own oil, because the Osage decided, you can't tell us we can't develop our own land. BIA said, yeah. So you know what they did? In 2009, it took over a century, in 2009, to get their oil back. They bid for their own property. They created another oil company. They said, well, if Getty Oil can bid, if Sinclair Oil can bid, then why can't Osage Oil bid? So they actually won some of their own leases on their own property. That's important because it's a very different type of drilling. But now going back to the killings, the reign of terror.
Right.
They killed, we know of at least 60 Osage that were murdered for their oil. More accurately would probably be 160 because there were so many mysterious deaths. I mean, there's a field filled with baby graves that are unexplained on the Osage property. There are, and all this to take their oil rights, plus to divide up and take their property. So Osage, the land was taken away from the tribe and divided up and given to individual Osage, with the idea correctly that the Osage would then be forced to sell off their properties to white people. In Oklahoma, when this happened, when the reservation properties were broken up, 90% of the land ended up in the hands of white non-Indians. 90%.
Of course.
So now where do we get? Why am I making a documentary? Well, because 30 years ago, you can see from my hat, those who know Greg Palast, I'm an investigative reporter, but I was an investigator before I was an investigative reporter. And the very first documentary I ever worked on was on the Osage reservation. And it was a story of theft of the oil, but not from the 1920s film. This is what's happened. Our documentary, whereas Killers of the Flower Moon ends in 1923, it's now 2023. Our documentary is the next 100 years of what happened to the Osage. Wow. And what happened to the Osage is a 4-letter word, K-O-C-H, Coke. So after the Osage lost their billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of oil to the big oil companies, they were left, after the end of World War II, they were just left with these little useless, to the big oil companies now, useless stripper wells, all these little teeny wells all over that could pump. You know those horses that you see going up and down? Those are called pump jacks. And you'll see teeny pump jacks all over the Osage reservation, 2,600 square miles, where these teeny pumps are still pumping oil, maybe a couple barrels a month, hardly anything, not enough to run a pipe from. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs found a kindly couple of this small oil operation out of Wichita, Kansas, which kindly said, well, we'll tell you what, we'll bring trucks out and we'll take the oil, we'll gather the oil, we'll pay the Osage for their oil, and then we'll take it over and give it to the big refiners. So this company was called Coke Oil, Coke Transport. And Coke agreed. It was very kind of them to agree to take to take the oil from the Osage properties. And they handled most of the oil for almost every reservation in America. Mainly Osage, where the big oil was. And they would send out their trucks. You have to understand, this is middle of nowhere. There's no one around for miles in most cases. And these trucks show up and they take their oil. They take a little gauge and they measure the oil that they've taken. And they put it on a piece of paper and they put it in a little jar and say, we took this much oil. That's very nice. Except that they would take 20 barrels of oil and write down 15.
Oh.
And now it's a few $100 here, a few $100 there.
Mm-hmm.
And it adds up to well over $1 billion of oil stolen from the Osage. And by the way, a lot of that property is U.S. government land. So it was theft from the Osage and it was theft from you and me, the taxpayer.
Wow.
And of course, when you're stealing oil, you don't pay taxes. It's like ask Al Capone. You don't necessarily pay taxes on what you steal.
Right.
It's pure easy squeezy. Over $1 billion. They did this over 4 decades. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs just turned their head and looked the other way. The other oil companies, ultimately, while the other oil companies simply protected themselves because they were being ripped off by Coke. But then finally, one of the Koch brothers, Bill Koch, got in a fight with David and Charles.
Oh, wow.
And began exposing the whole thing. Why? Because he sold his interest. Bill Koch sold his interest in Koch Oil to David and Charlie. He was only about 18.
Mm-hmm.
And they gave him $500 million. Now, when you're an 18-year-old kid, especially back in the 70s, hey, $500 million is a lot of change for a kid.
I'm in my 50s. And that sounds good to me.
It sounds good. In my neighborhood, it's a lot of money.
Right.
But then he realized, wait, they didn't cut me in on the thievery. And that was Koch Oil's big money, what they stole. This is not minor stuff. This is what created, you have to understand, Osage Oil not only built Sinclair Oil, Standard Oil, now Exxon, Phillips, Conoco, all these companies that came out of the Osage land. But the theft of Osage Oil is what created Koch Oil. These were nothing. In fact, just so you know, when I did this investigation in '96, I couldn't get anyone interested in the media on running this story. I couldn't get it. I went to NBC, I went to Dateline. No one was interested in this story. Then I became a journalist right after that for The Guardian. And while I wrote a story for The Guardian on the richest guys you've never heard of, no one knew who the Kochs were. Just these guys out of Wichita. And I couldn't get anyone interested. Who cares about some guys from Wichita named Koch with a funny name? Koch, by the way.
Right.
Now they are the big bête noir. Well, this is what started it. And now also, this has not only created the Koch's multi-billion-dollar wealth from what they stole and began their operation, but in addition, this is what started the Koch political machine. And the way that happened, and this is important to understand the story. I told you that they were stealing oil. Now, how do we know? We're not guessing. It's not just because one of their brothers started ratting on them, but because he's a guy with a few bucks and therefore some influence. The U.S. Senate opened an investigation because there were articles in the Arizona Republic. So there was an investigation by the United States Senate into theft of native resources. And a whole big part of it was the accusations about Koch. So I just spoke last week with the special prosecutor who was assigned to the U.S. Senate Investigations Committee. His name is Ken Ballin. Mm-hmm. And he'd run the Iran-Contra investigation. And he came off Iran-Contra, got to this one, called the FBI and said, send me your best agent. They said, well, we have 10,000 agents. He said, fine, send me the best one. They said, well, his name is Jim Elroy, known as, he's kind of like the real life Dirty Harry of the FBI. So they sent Jim Elroy out into the field, and he always insisted on going disguised and undercover. Right. He didn't believe in showing up in the suit with the snap brim hat and saying, FBI, can I talk to you? He went out dressed like a cattleman, hiding behind cattle with long lens cameras, filming the theft. We have the cameras. We have the film of the theft. Now, he then got 50. They ended up with 50 agents on this. They got over 50 people on that worked for Koch, drivers, managers, you name it, because the FBI said, we've got you on camera. They have 50 confessions from Coke drivers, operatives, and managers. And they all said the same thing. We didn't pocket a penny. This was all for Charlie Coke. Now we think of by the way, the Koch brothers, we think of Charles and David.
Right.
David was kind of a nebbish who went along for the ride. Charlie was the mastermind of the thievery and the mastermind of Koch Industries. Even today, he is the mastermind of Koch Industries. And what he did was he was telling people, you either get the overages, which is what his term he made up for theft.
Overage.
You get me more overage or you lose your job. And one driver after another said, we either stole it, we felt bad. We felt terrible. You should, when you see the film, you see these guys talking to me, say they just feel horrible. But it was that there's no work out there in the middle of Oklahoma. It was dealing for Coke or you're unemployed. And worse, if you ratted on them, they were worried very, very, very much worried for their safety. They didn't trust Charlie Coke. And so you had so now what happened to Charlie Coke? You got the FBI with photos, you got confessions, you had a U.S. Senate hearing. So the U.S. Senate, under Senators, the chairman were DeConcini and McCain.
Oh, McCain.
Yep. And they were both threatened. McCain was threatened by Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader at the time. That was back in about 89, 90, who would then, of course, run for president against Clinton.
Bob Dole remembers Bob Dole.
Bob Dole. And so Bob Dole threatened Nichols, said, you got to can this investigation. I can't use the words because I don't want you pulled off the air of McCain's reply. In addition, I spoke to Senator DeConcini. And it turns out he had told me that that Coke, while he bought the Republican Party to put the heat on McCain. DeConcini is a Democrat, so they literally hired the chairman of the Democratic Party, Bob Strauss. Charlie Coke hired the chairman of the Democratic Party to walk into DeConcini's office and say, "Listen, if you say that Charlie Coke stole oil, if you say Charlie Coke's a criminal, he will spend whatever money it takes to destroy your political career. You're finished."
Oof.
And DeConcini basically said, "F you," and wrote the report. The report was issued by the United States Senate saying, quote, "Coke oil is the #1 example of mass thievery of oil from an Indian reservation." That was the U.S. Senate committee report. They had the testimony of the eyewitnesses, incling the FBI agents and Elroy, et cetera.
And I imagine McCain had no trouble signing on to that either.
so what happened was that was the end of DeConcini's career. They spent the money to destroy him. They went after McCain. He made some amends with Dole, but basically he was in hot water for a while. But what happened to Coke? The answer was the Senate committee and the FBI turned over the photographs, the confessions, the evidence, the findings, everything. It was a lock-on case and a draft indictment against Coke Oil for racketeering and theft on an Indian reservation.
Right.
And of course, theft from the U.S. government. And it also indicted Charlie Coke. There was an indictment of Charlie Coke. They impaneled a grand jury, which was hearing the evidence, which was about to vote the indictment. And Charlie Coke was expected to go to prison for, a decade or so. And that would have been the end of Coke Oil and Charlie.
Not totally. But
Coke, this is the beginning of the Coke political machine. So the Cokes are, by the way, pretty much nonpartisan, apolitical. They weren't apolitical. Fred Koch founded the ultra-right racist John Birch Society.
Oh, geez.
Charlie Koch, his son, when Fred died in '62, took over the John Birch Society. This was a vicious organization which accused people of being communists. And you have to understand the Osage were being accused of being communists too, because their ritual dances, and I can't make this up, were considered operations in aid of communist Russia. I can't make this up. This is one way to go after it. So you go after the Indians by saying they're really, when you see them dancing in those feathers, it's actually a communist dance. I can't make this stuff up. Okay.
I'm sure Khrushchev was grateful.
Seen Khrushchev in his war paint,
You
right?
know.
So I mean, we could laugh at it, but it was
I know
horrific.
it's terrible, but I'm just
Terrifying.
it's so ridiculous. I can't help but laugh.
Yeah. So what happened was that they had the indictment. Charlie Coke Oil was about to be basically put out of business through this indictment, and Charlie going to prison. And but then Coke suddenly gave $100,000 to Senator Don Nichols of Indiana. And you have to understand, at that time, $10,000 was considered enormous funding for a politician.
Oh, yeah.
And suddenly there's $100,000. And then they gave $250,000 to Bob Dole, the Republican leader. Now, again, you have to understand, it used to be $2,500 was a big donation.
Oh, yeah.
$250,000? Like, now, here's the thing. But they couldn't do anything straight. That's impossible for Coke. So they put it through. It was corporate money. Now, understand, this is before Citizens United.
Right.
Corporate money from Coke Oil is itself a felony crime. So to get out of an indictment for a felony, they start committing a series of felony crimes. Now, I don't say this lightly because I don't want you in trouble or me in trouble.
I understood.
So when I say they committed crimes, I can tell you I've spoken to 3 United States prosecutors and to top FBI officials who all said this is absolutely a criminal conspiracy. It is a racketeering. It's racketeering at its worst. And of course, a violation at that time of federal law against corporate contributions to campaigns. So, by the way, Bob Dole got caught and had to give back the $250,000. But in the meantime, Dole and Nichols, the Republican senators, used their senatorial privilege to replace the prosecutor who had written up the indictment of Coke. They put in a guy who actually had contracts with Coke Oil, a real pro-industry guy, as prosecutor, who immediately disbanded the grand jury, quashed the indictment, and did something that has, as far as I know, has never been done in the history of the United States Justice Department. The guy sent a letter to Charlie Coke saying, "You're not a criminal. You're off the hook. We found no evidence of criminality."
Wow.
The Justice Department does not issue "you are innocent" letters.
No.
We don't have that in the United States of America.
Well, technically, you're presumed innocent unless proven guilty.
Because you're right. So, but they actually gave them a get out of jail free letter, which has never happened. Right after he sent out the get out of free jail letter, this guy had just been named prosecutor. Right after that is suddenly named by Nichols and Dole to the federal bench. He's given a lifetime federal judgeship.
Of course.
And now, I'm not going to say one was a payoff for the other, but I will tell you that a U.S. special prosecutor who was deeply involved in the investigation said it doesn't pass the smell test. You put in a prosecutor, they kill off a prosecution where the evidence is solid gold right on, and then you suddenly make him a judge. And then the people who did the deal get gazillions in donations. And by the way, just so you know, like I said, they hired the chairman of the Democratic Party. One of their big deals is they had to end the New Deal. So they decided that they realized that they could make huge profits if they owned the United States Congress. So that meant working in a way with 2 parties. Remember, the Kochs, they're not Republicans. They hate the Republican Party. They despise the Republican Party, always have. But they give it hundreds of millions of dollars. You say, well, why? Because they want to own it. But they also decided to help start an organization that would be an anti-FDR, anti-New Deal wing of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave Bill Clinton $100,000
Yep.
to create the Democratic Leadership Council,
The DLC.
the DLC, to create within the Democratic Party basically an anti-democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And that was a Koch creation. So if you're wondering where do we get Bill Clinton and Al Gore from? Same place we got Bob Dole from. Now think about it. Bob Dole ran against Bill Clinton. They're paying off Clinton. They're paying off Dole, right? And as I say, so the Kochs aren't partisan. They don't, because being partisan is betting on a horse. They don't bet on horses. They buy the whole goddamn racetrack.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Why would you? Why would you pick one team when you can just be the person who owns the entire thing? I get the logic. It's just the problem is that takes it completely out of our hands as being self-governing.
well, you get to pretend you're self-governing. They still let you go in and pull a lever and vote.
Yay.
But they pick the candidates. They tell you they give you your choices and say, pick one of our guys or the other of our guys.
Oh my God.
So that's how the system works. But the thing is that Koch changed the whole game by massive amounts of money, including, by the way, I mean, I will say that Clinton didn't let them get away with everything. Under the Clinton administration, they were facing criminal charges of 315 counts of criminal toxic pollution, deliberately polluting waterways. Mm-hmm. Now, to get out of that required that you change federal law. To change federal law, you had to take over the United States Congress.
Right.
So, are you ready for this part?
Mm-hmm.
They did. They bought. Now, how do you buy a whole Congress? Well, for half a century, the Democrats controlled Congress, the House of Representatives. You always had Democrats. There was no chance for Republicans. Mm-hmm. But when Clinton had just become president, what they did was Koch Industries. Again, it's illegal for a corporation to do this, but Koch Industries created a cutout company called Triad, which is interesting, kind of named after the Asian mafia. They created this group named after the Asian mafia called Triad. Triad then created these fronts, including Campaign for Our Children's Future, CCF.
I remember that one.
Now, what CCF did, and what this is Koch to Triad to these front groups, in the 2 weeks and just the week before the 94 and then 96 election, they were spending tens of millions of dollars. You have to understand, tens of millions of dollars at that time was like a nuclear weapon.
Right.
And this was a mystery group because at that time, there were no such things as 527 accounts or PACs. They didn't exist. Okay, so they created these fake front groups, which reported nothing, didn't say who they were, and they ran these ads in 35 Democratic districts where Democrats were ahead but weak, but they assumed that they were going to win, and ran ads saying, for example, one guy beat his wife, one guy's a drunk, one guy did this, one guy did that. In the case of Jill Docking, actually, I can't remember whether she was running for governor or Senate, I'm trying to remember. They accused Jill Docking of being Jewish, which is true, actually. Mm-hmm. But that was enough. Yeah, they would do something called, they paid for something called push polling. You call up every person in Kansas and you say, we're taking a poll. Who do you support for Senate? Jill Docking. Would you still support Jill Docking if you knew she was Jewish? Right. And okay, so no matter what the answer is, you're getting out there that you're getting Jewish. Right. So it's called push polling, where you put something in someone's ear, some poison in someone's ear. And so so what happened was there was this shock when the Republicans took over Congress for the first time in 50 years. The nation was just absolutely stunned and shocked that this had happened. But they didn't know about Triad. They didn't know how this happened. And once they got that, they had Newt Gingrich as their Speaker of the House, who then proceeded to implement what he called the Contract for America. Yep, or the Contract on America, as I want to call it. On America, for those of us who, right? It was a hit job on America, but they were doing the hit for the Kochs because the Kochs actually drafted the contract for America. They drafted the entire legislative program for Newt Gingrich using as their fronts. They created and funded these huge think tanks: Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, Federalist Society, all these organizations, Citizens United, all these groups, which they formed with a guy named Foster Friess. He's not an ice cream. He was a right-wing billionaire, crypto fascist. And I don't mean crypto like Bitcoin.
No.
So you literally had the Kochs rewriting legislation, which decriminalized their toxic dumping. What they did was they pushed really hard, like this shouldn't be a crime. And by the way, even today, they're still working on that type of stuff, decriminalizing their illegal behavior. As you know, their illegal campaign contributions, they got legalized by pushing for the Citizens United decision to create a new court. They created the Federalist Society to recreate the judiciary. They are the ones that make the right-wing recommendations. Like when you got right-wingers like Kavanaugh and
Gorsuch.
Gorsuch and the rest of these guys, they all, Roberts, they were all part and recommended by the Federalist Society, in other words, a Koch organization. So these are Koch personally approved appointments to the Supreme Court. And they gave us Citizens United, which said, okay, if the Kochs illegally gave money, we'll just say it's not a crime anymore. And they do the same with pollution. It's not a crime anymore. Even when Charles Koch does things that you think are progressive, what is the secret agenda? For example, Koch has given a lot of money for so-called prison reform, sentencing reform.
Right.
Now, that's good. It just says that, so he worked very hard on decriminalizing jail time for, and he does today. He's given a ton of money to decriminalize drugs, to decriminalize. By the way, he wants to completely open the border. So he wants to decriminalize undocumented immigration so that the border is completely open because he wants cheap labor. And part of that trick is that in that decriminalization, they stick in, well, it's not a crime to deliberately dump toxins on someone's oil water supply. It's just it's decriminalized. It's a fine, just like they would decriminalize marijuana, where you just get a traffic ticket, but you just get a little fine for this toxic dumping,
right.
even though it kills people.
Yeah. So the gutting of the Clean Air and Water Act, basically, Koch's got a lot of fingerprints on those.
Absolutely. And so they don't have. It's wrong to say that they are supporting Republicans. Obviously, as I like to say, the Kochs. Yes, the Kochs have purchased the Republican Party, but they rent the Democratic Party when they need to, and they've been pretty good at that. So I won't say every politician's susceptible to bribery, because I just told you about how McCain stood up, how DeConcini was willing to literally give up his political career to go after these guys.
Admirable.
And they go after people. And, the only reasons I'm still here and standing is that because I worked for BBC and The Guardian, they were not going to be intimidated. But I can tell you right now, you have a lot of U.S. outlets which won't touch anything I say about the Kochs. The Kochs did become, the bête noire, but it was, even though they are, by many on the left, they're seen as the ultimate evil. And I don't, I'll get away from the religious terms. I can say that they are absolutely a crime wave. And by the way, I say that as an expert on racketeering. I was an expert on racketeering for the United States Justice Department. I don't throw around things like racketeering and fraud and conspiracy
Loosely.
Loosely. I'm saying them in the highly technical terms of federal law, which I've worked on quite a bit. And so I can tell you, I myself, having done racketeering cases, the fact that Charlie Koch is walking around free, one U.S. prosecutor told us, the one who actually wrote up the indictment of Charlie Koch, I asked her to go on camera, and she simply said, it's so painful to me. It's so painful to me that this criminal is still walking around free that I can't even talk about it. It's so upsetting. And, I'd like her to express that on camera, but instead we do have in the film, Long Knife will be FBI agent James Elroy, who, out of anger, did resign from the FBI when the indictment was quashed.
Oh my!
And he has never dropped this. In 30 years, he's continued to keep his eye on Charlie Koch.
Just from a moment here, I'm just imagining. So this is a fellow who isn't going to go out and use the intimidating suit and tie. He goes out dressed for the environment, camouflaged, make sure he gets all the evidence. He's got these people dead to rights, and he sees it get thrown away. I could see where that would be career-endingly frustrating, and I totally get that. Now, I just want to make sure to remind our listeners and viewers, we have Greg Palast, as you can see over here in the hat. He, again, known for his investigative reports for BBC, Democracy Now!, Rolling Stone, been investigating the Koch brothers, and I believe Charles is the lone survivor of them now, but for 30 years, and has a new film, as he mentioned, Long Knife, Osage Oil, and the new Trail of Tears, and that's spring 2024, companion piece to the other film that Leonardo DiCaprio has been working on, and takes off not just from 1923, but brings it right to the present day. And
That's
Greg,
right.
I really appreciate the fact that you've been so determined to make sure to get all of this put together. Now,
Well, I want to give some credit, by the way, to
yeah,
the
go ahead.
DiCaprio family and the wonderful director Martin Scorsese, because they have been helpful. George DiCaprio, Leonardo's dad, by the way, is our producer for this film.
Oh, very good.
Because the Osage leadership, Chief Standing Bearer, has made a special request to have us tell this story. He knows my work. We've been out there, and it's very important to him that you understand that the Osage didn't just disappear after the reign of terror 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They're still here. They're still fighting. They're still a sophisticated group of people who are, still in the fight with the oil companies,
Mm-hmm.
still in a fight with the Bureau of Indian Affairs,
Mm-hmm.
still in a fight for their sovereignty and control of their properties. They
Made their own oil company to make sure they had another in on the process. It just shows how dogged they are about this, which is great.
Well, understand that these are. I've worked with a lot of tribal groups from Alaska to New Mexico. And the Osage are some of the most sophisticated. Part of it is because for a while they did have their oil wealth, and they spent it interestingly. There were lots of stories at the time. Oh, they bought furs and big cars. Well, most millionaires bought furs and big cars. But they spent their biggest money was actually on education. They sent their kids to Stanford, Oxford, UCLA, and of course the two greatest prima ballerinas in probably world history, but certainly American history, are Maria and Marjorie Tall Chief, or as they were born, Tall Chief. They were the daughters of the Tall Chief. The Osage, by the way, are the tallest people in the world.
Oh,
and they don't look like your cigar store Indians, though you're used to seeing one. The guy in every silent film, there was always that really elegant chief with the full headdress, in the old silent films, riding the horse, looking very majestic.
mm-hmm.
That, in fact, was Chief Standing Bear, one of the original Chief Standing Bears, Luther, who was also not only a great actor of the silent era, but he was a extraordinary best-selling author. It's from him that we learn the Osage and American Native concept of being in tune with Mother Nature. So he was in the 20s and 30s, he was writing books trying to explain, here's what Indian culture can offer you. Now, you have to understand, when he was writing that, it was against the law for natives to practice their religion.
Yes.
It was, you could go, I want to repeat that.
Mm-hmm.
If you did native dances and you practiced your rituals, you were subject to arrest in the 30s, 20s, and 30s. You were subject, it was against the law to practice the native religion.
And even and even after that period, it was being demonized as being communist, for crying out loud.
Yes, and so the right wing is demonizing it as communist. But in the meantime, in the 1930s, we had a president, FDR.
Mm-hmm.
The New Deal was crafted by his Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes. and Ickes was actually had lived on native reservations and was very close to the native community. And he totally reversed. He not only decriminalized, but he actually encouraged the American native religions. He encouraged the dancing and traditions and clothing, and totally changed the operation. So one of the things he did was he moved to try to create more sovereignty where the tribal groups get their rights. Now we have to understand, American natives did not receive the right to vote. They were not recognized as full citizens until 1926. One of the original chief standing bears, in fact, was the first American native to be recognized in court as a human being. So Chief Standing Bear in 1876, the chief at the time, went into the courtroom and told the judge, you know what? I'm a human being. See? And he used Shakespeare's line, if I bleed the same color you do. I bleed red like you. Are you going to tell me, Your Honor, that I'm not a man? And the judge said, I think you're a man. And that was the first American native to ever be recognized as a human being. Now, they gave them some human recognition because they needed someone to sign treaties that said, here, you can have our land. But full rights. So the first recognition of a human being as native was Standing Bear of 1876. Then you had, it wasn't until 1926 that they got the vote. And it was not till until the 30s, they were finally decriminalized, that their native culture was decriminalized. It wasn't until 1964 and 1965 Voting Rights Act that they were allowed the rights to ballots in their own languages and polling stations. Though, of course, I just want you to know that as the Osage told me, they've been removing polling stations from native lands, including, for example, the only reason I'll give you, this is a really fun story. I got to give you this once.
Okay.
The only way that Joe Biden became president is because the Osage, in particular, ran a campaign to protect the native vote. Now, a lot of people know Greg Palast, know me through my books.
Oh, yeah.
My book, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy.
Yes, sir.
Our Madhouse, my films, Our Madhouse. I have my
Vigilante.
other film, Vigilante,
Yep.
Georgia's vote suppression hitman. So I work a lot on vote suppression issues. And I can tell you right now, as I said on BBC and I've written in my books, there is no group in the United States which suffers more vote suppression than American natives. No one comes close. So, for example, in the Biden-Trump race in 2020, the Republican legislature of Arizona was removing polling stations from native lands, native reservations in Arizona. Now, as you know, Biden became president by winning Arizona by something like 14,000 votes. That was it.
Not very many.
Not very many. So they removed, are you ready for this? Every single polling station off the Yaqui Pascua reservation. Not one polling station. None.
Wow.
They're removing polling stations all over. The Republicans are doing this all over the country. Why? Because American natives vote solid Democrat. I mean, even much more than African Americans or any other ethnic group, they are solid Democrats. And so they know that if they screw with the native vote, they screw with the Pueblo vote and the reservation vote, that favors the Republicans. So they thought, okay, we don't have to worry about the res because they don't have a place to go. If they want to vote, they have to drive 100 miles round trip outside the reservation to vote.
Wow.
So what they did was they ran these campaigns to show people and help them do mail-in voting. So
the Osage did, yeah.
The Osage helped the others because they had the funds and the sophistication to help people. For example, it's hard. One of the ways that they were taking away native votes is that George Bush was really, well, he wasn't sharp about anything. It was Karl Rove, his brain, came up with things like, after 9/11, this was a cover. They said you can't get a mail-in ballot. In fact, you can't even register to vote unless you have a post office recognized mailing address. Supposedly national security. Well, you have to understand, on the res, there are addresses like half a mile east of the gas station.
Right.
That would be a reservation.
Yeah, totally not recognizable by a
Right.
post office. Yeah.
So it's not officially postal recognized. So they got them addresses. They got them to fill out the ballots and how it's done properly, because they're always disqualifying. That's a whole other story where they disqualify these mail-in ballots from the reservations.
All the various tricks they pull, the caging and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah. So they do these tricks. So again, because the Osage ran this campaign and restored native votes, that was in Nevada and it was in Arizona. You would have lost. Nevada was another state that was just a few thousand votes for Biden. If the American Native groups did not run this massive anti-suppression campaign, Biden would not be president. This is an important vote. And we're going to tell that story in Long Knife. By the way, the reason it's called Long Knife is that, or in the Osage language, it's Mahita. Mahita means long knife because it refers to the Indian agents that were sent by Washington. And remember, the Osage were not allowed to touch their own money. So even when they had millions, in fact, we have one case of a child dying of starvation because their guardian would not release the money to feed them. I'm not making that one up. And so even Chief Standing Bearer, who is listed, he showed me the book. We went over to the Indian Agency office, and there's a big leather book. He opens it up. There's his name listed as incompetent, mentally incompetent. Now, you have to understand, Chief Standing Bearer is one of the top trial attorneys in Oklahoma.
Right. So, yeah.
He comes from a long line of college-educated people who are all listed as mentally incompetent because they're Indians. And so what happens is he's incompetent, this trial lawyer, supposedly. They can't get their own money. I mean, and only now recently have they fought and got control. They can literally have their own bank accounts, but they used to have to go to the Mahita, the guy with the long knife, to say, I need groceries for this week. And they would make out a requisition. They were never allowed to touch their money. They'd go to the local store where the guy would then charge them 10 times as much, send the bill to the Indian agent, to the Mahita. And by the way, that includes President Herbert Hoover's uncle, Herbert Hoover lived on the Osage Reservation in Powhuska, where his father was the Mahita, the long knife. And they said long knife because he used to carry swords.
Right.
And believe it or not, I will say one thing for Herbert Hoover. He lived on the Osage Reservation and picked an Osage as his vice president. Vice President Curtis under Herbert Hoover was an Osage.
Oh,
and of course, incompetent.
All right. So, Greg, thank you so much for coming on here and giving us really quite a thorough view of why there was a necessity to create this kind of a documentary, Long Knife, Osage Oil, and the New Trail of Tears, again, to be released in spring 2024. Now, I understand you've provided us with a trailer.
Yes, I have. And by the way, if you want to spread around the trailer too, besides sending out Aldous' program, you go to gregpalast.com. That's GregPalast, gregpalast.com. Sign up there, no charge. We'll keep you informed. We won't flood you with a lot of crap, but we'll keep you informed of when the film is coming out. We're doing this in coordination with Killers of the Flower Moon. We have some restrictions out of respect for the writers and actors strike, so that's why we're holding off for the moment. And because Leonardo is quite a union activist, and the last thing we're going to do is bust a strike. So
I would also not support that either. So now I'm happy to say though that right now we can provide you with the trailer for Long Knife, Osage Oil, and the New Trail of Tears.
Hawe dahi nikshe nikapaki zonzoli wajaji. Ali Wakanda Kistomiha. They couldn't kill all of us.
Charles Koch said when one of his executives asked him who was wired, "You're already a billionaire, why are you stealing a few dollars a week from poor Indians?" And Koch said, "Because I want my fair share." And that's all of it.
He stated that he didn't want to pay a royalty to us, that we didn't deserve it.
They would be drinking, and they said, "I don't know why anyone robs banks when you could drill for oil on Indian lands." Wow.
2.4 billion.
But it's not over. It's still happening.
I always say the white man's got big medicine. He can do bad things and get away with it.
All right. Thank you, Greg, for the trailer. Again, that's at gregpalast.com. And don't worry, if for some reason you have trouble spelling a complicated name like Palast, I will have it linked both at the YouTube description and also at TMI.com so that people can directly get there. And that way they can keep up to date about the release of Long Knife. Now, with that in mind, Greg, thank you so much for coming on here and letting us know all about this. This is definitely the kind of information that I want to make sure that not just my viewers and listeners, but everybody eventually gets to know.
Yeah, it's time we learn our own history, because the history of the Osage is our history.
Absolutely.
And they just went through it first.
Well, I am grateful very much so for your work on this for sure, and very much also to the Osage tribe and people and nation for allowing you everything that they have allowed you to do here and giving you full permission to put this out there.
Yes, I have to say this is unusual because they for good reason, American Native nations are very suspicious of how white people enter their areas and tell stories about them. You know,
Why wouldn't they be?
And you know, and have these people been murdered by outsiders? They have been robbed by outsiders, but they really thought that this story is important to know about them, but also to understand that the Koch, crime syndicate and where it began and their first victims. I think they want you to understand this story because, what they did to the Osage, they're doing to us. That they just practiced on the Osage.
Oh,
and that's why I'm thrilled that they've been so cooperative and open, and not only cooperative and open, but actually insistent that this film get made. And so we gotta thank this. This will give you an insight into the issues today, not just 100 years ago, of our native nations.
All right. Again, Greg Palast, thank you so much. Again, keep up with Greg Palast at gregpalast.com. This is not the only thing he's working on, but this is definitely the one I wanted to make sure that you knew about right now.
Thank you.
You've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. We'll be right back.